In this video, we'll discuss noise and sharpness as the reasons for rejecting your photo and what can you do about it. Let's start with noise. Two common reasons for noise to appear in your photos are either you use too of a high ISO setting during taking your picture, or you just overdid your post-processing. Let's take a look at an example of noisy picture. This picture I took with ISO of 1600, which is quite high. And as you can see, with full magnification, there is some noise present in the picture, and this would cause the image to get rejected should I upload it. Now, this is something you should always do with your images that you plan to submit to agencies. Zoom into 100 or even 200%, just like I'm doing right now, and examine your image really up close. If you see any lack of sharpness, any noise being present there, that is a problem you need to deal with. In our case, we've got noise here. I'm using Lightroom to edit my photos, and I do highly recommend it for any photographers out there. So under Detail tab in the Edit screen of Lightroom, you find the noise reduction sliders. You can just play around with these. There is no silver bullet setting, no one size fits all, so you just need to find whatever fits your image best and fiddle around with these sliders until you see the noise disappear. One thing to keep in mind though is don't overdo it. If you think that you can just max out your noise reduction parameters, your picture becomes really blurry. It looks like with a heavy layer of makeup. You can try to edit it away, but don't overdo it, don't overkill. The best thing you can do not to have noise in the pictures is not to create it in the first place. What can you do about that? Well, rule number one, shoot in RAW mode. Don't shoot JPEGs. If your camera allows shooting RAW, then shoot RAW. The image quality is much higher and it allows you for much more flexibility during your post-processing. Also, use as low ISO setting as you can. This would be either 100 or 200 ISO depending on your camera make. And the lower ISO, the lower the ISO, the lower noise you get. Also, if you're shooting long exposure photography, like 5, 10, 60 seconds images, this also generates a lot of noise because the sensor heats up during the process of taking the picture, and the heat manifests itself as noise in your photo. So try to stay away from long exposure photography, or if you do, you can use some features the camera might have to reduce the noise with a long exposure photographer. Like Nikon cameras, they have the option to take your long exposure picture, let's say 15 seconds, and after that they take another 15-second exposure with closed shutter. So they basically just collect the noise itself and then subtract it from the picture you've taken, resulting in much higher quality images for long exposure photos. To wrap up the noise issue, try to stay as low with your ISO as you can during taking your pictures. Don't overdo your post-processing. If you take your images and they're too dark, if you try to max up the exposure, then again the noise comes up and it's much more visible. And lastly, when you're editing your noise out of your pictures, do it, but don't overdo it. By the way, I took this photo with by today's standards ancient Nikon D70 at ISO of 800, which is basically a noise generator at these settings, but with proper post-processing I was able to get this image accepted. Also what helps is that the subject of the image is very specific, so the agency was able to lower the standards a little bit when it comes to noise, so they can get this very specific kind of image in their collection. Another issue that can make your image get rejected is sharpness. This can either mean that your image is out of focus or it's motion blurred. There is not much you can do about this in the post-processing, so try to get it right while shooting the picture. When it comes to focusing, learn to use your autofocus settings on your camera. If you're using the automatic selection of focus points, you have no control over what the camera is going to pick. There is no need to overkill and focus manually all the time, although you might feel more professional doing that. Using autofocus is fine, just learn to use it well and learn to have control over where the camera is focusing. That being said, this doesn't mean that all your pictures need to be razor sharp in focus. This one, for example, this picture of mine is not focused at all, but it does not matter because the nature of the photo is it's supposed to be a colorful, blurred abstraction that's suitable for use as a background image, and background image would be really distracting if it was razor sharp all over. So if you decide to shoot some background images, like these colorful blurs and splashes of color, feel free to be out of focus, but again, be in control. Be in control. So be out of focus intentionally. If you feel it adds to the picture, then be out of focus. It also helps to add to the keywords or the title that the picture is out of focus or blurred, so the reviewer knows this is your purpose, this is the purpose you're following with the picture, it's not a mistake. Motion blur is another reason that can get your images rejected. Usually this would be the shaky photos, the picture that obviously is not sharp because the camera moved during the process, during the exposure. And I mean, you can tell this yourself. When you zoom in to the picture, you can see if it is or if it's not motion blurred. How to prevent motion blur? Two basic steps you can take. Either use shorter exposure time, so even though the camera is moving in your hands, it doesn't manifest in the photo being blurry, or use a tripod. This all being said, there are creative ways you can use motion blur in your pictures, but it needs to be intentional. This image of a river, for example, the motion blur of the water, the long exposure of the water, adds some dynamics. It makes the picture interesting. So here the motion blur is present, but is not a reason to reject the photo. This picture of mine also includes a lot of motion blur, but despite that, it got accepted and it sells really well because it's very dynamic and the blur serves a purpose. The blur serves a purpose of making the image very dynamic, active. You feel like being on the street riding your bike next to this lady when you're looking at this picture. So again, be intentional with the motion blur if you decide to use it. This one, that's an abstract picture of mine. This is a metro tunnel, and again I used long exposure here, so the image is blurred, but it's blurred on purpose. And the blur itself adds to the image. And lastly, this one, taken from a driving car. Also you can see some blur in this area, but again the blur doesn't harm the image, it doesn't make it lower quality. On the contrary, it makes the image more interesting, so it adds to the image. So to wrap up this video, Be careful about your noise, shoot low ISO and use raw setting when you're selecting the format of your pictures. And be careful about motion blur and out of focus blur in your photos. If you decide to use them, it's okay, use them, but use them with the purpose and use them so they enhance your photo, not damage the quality of your photo. See you in the next video.